Welcome to Uncommon Core, where we explore the big ideas in crypto from first principles. This show is hosted by Su Zhu, the CEO and Chief Investment Officer of Three Arrows Capital, and me, Hasu, a crypto researcher and writer. Hey, I'm sitting down today with Su Zhu, my regular co-host. Actually, congrats to earning the title Crypto Villain of the Year 2021. I think you were ranked first in a recent article. This is a huge achievement for you, obviously. Is there anything that you want to say to your fans?
Well, it's actually really funny because the way that I kind of have conceptualized like my image over the years is that, when I started out, it was basically just investing and trading, right? Like basically I called the bottoms and the tops all 2019, 2020, and pretty much a very pro Ethereum and Bitcoin stance for the most part throughout. And, this year as the markets have developed and, follower accounts have gone up like 10x, 20x, gone into some other ecosystems as well. And kind of just now zooming out and starting to like analyze what, were the priors that I had in the beginning and what are the priors that have come out, what are the things that have happened now. It has kind of made me question sort of, what is the way that crypto will evolve in the future, and also like what are the kind of traps that I think crypto communities are starting to fall into, and what are kind of the problems. So I think it's interesting to me that it's like the idea of a villain, because I'm kind of refuting a lot of the things that kind of the Bitcoin and Ether OGs, especially the Ether OGs, think of as like these holy truths, right? But those tweets got 15,000 likes, and the reason is that the new users and the new people that they actually resonate with this stuff, right? They view crypto as something that belongs not to the OGs; it belongs to them as well. And so that's something that we can talk about more in depth later, but kind of a good way that I would personally think about it.
So what holy truths are you talking about here?
Well, I think Bitcoin and Ether have a lot in common, right? They have this idea that layer one needs to be kept as decentralized as possible, and then layer two is where we scale. So with this, you have on Bitcoin, the Lightning Network, and then on Ethereum, you have a number of L2 solutions, both optimistic rollup and ZK rollup. And kind of the assumption in both of these coins is that people will be willing to sort of wait around for these L2 solutions in order to use blockchains, essentially, right? So, and the reason why they should be willing to wait around for these L2 solutions is because they value the decentralization of the base chain, and they also value the overall quality and community of those networks, right? So I think, not that these holy truths are wrong. It's just that while this is right, there's other truths that are also right. And so I think thinking back to the bear market, guys like Hausamani and Multicoin and sort of their thesis on crypto being quite a different one from the sort of canonical Bitcoin and Ether thesis that most funds and most investors had at that time. They chose to say, okay, what are we, what kinds of networks will reach 1 billion users, right? And so, through that framework, they invested in very different things than most of us did, right? They invested in BNB, they invested in Solana, they invested in sort of a host of things that were considered very, very contrarian at that time. And I think that, if you look at the prices of coins now versus April of this year, Bitcoin and Ether are basically flat, right? Bitcoin's slightly down, Ether a little bit down, and then BNB up a lot, and Solana up multiples, Avalanche up multiples, quite a few layer ones up multiples, and so thinking to this, and then looking at some of these theses, and also seeing kind of what the newer institutional investors are thinking about when they come into the space, I am struck by a kind of cognitive dissonance, I think, that the market has, and the split in mindset between sort of the way the OGs think about crypto and what the project is doing, and then what sort of is actually unfolding, right? where half the MetaMask users are actually BSC users, for instance, or where people are indeed more willing, not less willing, to participate in newer networks, in large part because they can be early, right? As we were early on Bitcoin and Ether. So I kind of see a lot of the same mistakes that Bitcoin maximalists made. I actually see a lot of Ethereum maximalists make the same mistakes now, where they kind of take it for granted that we all agree that like ETH is the asset that we're going to build on, or like this is the reason why we do things. And I starting to kind of see how that all plays out in the sense that Bitcoin and Ether are probably the soundest monies in crypto, right? They kind of have the best distributions and they have the most decentralization, but that doesn't actually have as much network effect when it comes to adding new users to the network as you may think, right? So that in part is why for the same reasons that Ether gained on Bitcoin over the last year, other networks are now gaining on Ether, right? So I think that the main reason I see for this is that if you look at average address active addresses on Ether, it's not that much higher than 2017. It's not double, for instance, and that's something that we discussed before, and it's something that the reason given is that, well, these are whale chains and it's fine, and the new users will use other L2s or they'll use this or that, but it's going very much toward the Bitcoin 2017 roadmap, right? And I think the challenge there is just simply that users will not necessarily wait around for that. So I think while Bitcoin and Ether can be good monies, I don't know that Ethereum can sort of lord over other chains and say, all value accrues back to me, or all people have to settle back to me, because I don't think that is a business logic that makes sense, right? It's not a business logic that makes sense that eventually all users will pay rent back to ETH holders, right? It's not a given. I do think ETH can compete well as money against Bitcoin, because Bitcoin has a very different trade-off pool versus ETH. But I don't think that Ethereum itself as a network actually is that useful for most people, because I don't think they need that level of decentralization that Ether is trying to say it upholds. And I think that this is something that the market has just spoken already, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree that most users don't value decentralization. Most users are not willing to pay for decentralization because they don't value it very much. And so, I mean, I was very impressed by, is it really true that half or over half of MetaMask users are using BSC? I mean, that's a pretty impressive number. If so, but something also struck me that you said. So I think a big reason, and maybe even the biggest reason, that people flock to these new networks as well, it's not really that they want to use them, but it's more so that they want to be early to something, right?
Yes.
Isn't it a very dystopian vision of crypto that there's less network effect than we thought to these existing systems, and that people value being early so much more?
Yes, absolutely.
Doesn't that make it like a big casino where we just reinvent?
I don't think it's as dystopian as OGs think it is. So if you're an OG and you're sitting there holding a bunch of Bitcoin and Ether, for you it's dystopian because you wish other people came in and bought your bags, right? But if you're a new user, it's the opposite of dystopian. It's the same as you felt when you were early to these coins, right? So that kind of is really the beauty of crypto in a way too. And so there's kind of, I mean, this bull market has basically played out very differently than a lot of the OGs thought they would, right? I mean, a lot of people would have thought by now, surely Bitcoin's at over 100K, surely Ether is at over, 6K, and but since April, instead we've seen Solana go 8x, and we've seen Avalanche go 5x, 6x, and we've seen some of the, we've seen BNB go 10x, and so the world actually playing out very differently than kind of that thesis. So it's dystopian if you're a bag holder of Bitcoin and Ether, but it's not dystopian if you're a new user, right? And so it kind of drives at the store of value thesis for crypto. in a way, which I still believe in. But I just think that it's trickier than it appears. I think that the reality is that the big reason people come into crypto is because they want to enjoy the same kinds of gains that people who came in previously did, and they also want to be involved actively. That is to say, I think of Bitcoin and Ether now as more like philosophical coins, where if you're a normal person who has $1,000, $10,000, you are not really touching the base chain ever. You are not doing any actions. You're buying it in your Coinbase exchange account, and then you're hearing stories about it. Basically, you're basically hearing people talk about what Bitcoin and Ether are, and then you're buying those coins, but not actually transacting on chain, right? And so I think of these as like the philosophy coins, and then I think of like BSC, so Solana Avalanche, and these other ones as sort of stuff that people are using themselves. And so I think if you look at the active address counts, right, of the newer networks, they're growing very, very fast at incredible multiples per month. And yeah, you can say the reason is that there's a lot of DeFi Ponzi's and a lot of stuff, but there's actually the same way that Ethereum grew, right? I mean, Ethereum grew through DeFi Ponzi's as well in 2019 and 2020. So I think we're just seeing that run again, but in faster speed and across a lot more people. And so what scared me about Ethereum is that I think where Ethereum is today versus where I thought it would be 2 years ago is just a bit different, right? I'm sure it's the same for you, where I would have thought we have some ways to onboard a higher percentage of new users, which we don't, and so there's something to the idea of, I mean, I tweeted about the idea of like the founders dilemma, which is the idea that the founders, they sort of get some market share, but then they prove the market, but then they don't ultimately win the market. And I think that interestingly, I think that Ether has a good chance of winning the not winning, but sharing the market as money with Bitcoin. But I think it has actually a low chance now at this point, in part because it's so optimized as money to win the sort of smart contract execution environment and sort of the smart contract community long term. Because I think user acquisition is also very important, and I think the sort of the negative network effects that the guys like Multicoin pointed out years ago, they've kind of all happened this year, right? Whenever gas went high, eventually no one could use anything on DeFi, and then Ether price crashed, and then people stopped using, and so you see this again with NFTs, right? Where the fees went high, and then people couldn't buy the cheap NFTs anymore, and then the whole NFT market fell. So just kind of seeing this play out firsthand made me realize that the future is just going to be very multi-chain because Ethereum, for better or worse, it didn't scale to the point it needed to sort of compound network effects. Its network effect for users has kind of already stopped. Its network effect as a money is still growing, albeit slowly, but on par with Bitcoin speed.
Okay. I think there's a lot to unpick here in your answer for me. So I think the first thing, I mean, maybe the most easiest thing to address, you said Ethereum has over-optimized for being money. First, I would agree that Ether is probably the only real contender to Bitcoin in terms of store of value in the crypto space, and it's sort of very distinguished from BTC, which gives it a good long-term position. It has a much different security model with perpetual inflation, which is sort of it's Bitcoin's Achilles heel.
Yes.
That its security model in the long term is not figured out, whereas Ether's is, and Ethereum sort of gets positive cash flows as well from people actually using the chain via EIP 1559, and also from being used as collateral in proof of stake. So, but I would still be curious to learn in what sense has Ether over-optimized for being money. So, at what points did it make a trade-off, like a conscious trade-off, to say we designed the chain to be better money and worse as, let's say, an execution layer?
Sure. I think a good broad way to understand it is if you look at Antonio, the founder of DYDX's tweets about it afterward, and he said, the Ethereum user experience on layer one has basically not even 10x over 5 years. And at that time, the roadmap was very much to figure out how to cater to users and developers, right? And so I think just like if you just zoom out that far, it's pretty easy to see that we're in a very different place today on Ethereum than it was a couple years ago. And I think another easy way to see this is just with DeFi itself, right? Where if you look at the DeFi that's kind of really taken off and done well, it's been cross-chain, it's been non-Ethereum, right? So, Luna versus SNX, but then also, sort of projects on Avalanche versus projects on Ethereum. The same exact project, but they'll do better on Avalanche. And then you kind of get a sense that I think Ethereum rightfully says that they're the bedrock or kind of the birthplace of DeFi innovation, right? But what that also means is that if that's the main claim to sort of power, that becomes quite nostalgic, like in a way, right? Where what about the new users or what about the new developers? Where do they go? And what we're seeing is that new developers are just multi-EVM, right? So they deploy where the users are because their goal is to have their product be used. So an example is we back tranches, which is a quite novel mechanism for doing risk sharing across longs and shorts, and it's got one of the highest TVLs in DeFi, right? But they started off on BSC, and the founders love Ethereum, but they just said if I launch on L1, there's no way, and I'm not going to launch on Matic because if I'm going to launch on another chain anyways, I might as well launch where the actual users are, right? So
Okay.
This is kind of what we're seeing on the app side. And then if you look at the performance of DeFi coins too, right? When we had that podcast,
let's stick not with the performance. Let's stick with the sort of the tech for a second, because
sure.
So if we look at blockchains from actually first principles, it's really just it's a shared database where anyone can verify, or where anybody can see that the computation that was done, whether it's a transfer or a smart contract execution, that was done with integrity. So that was done correctly, right?
Yeah.
And you can have various kinds of such database, basically. So being the most centralized would be just Binance, right? A centralized exchange. Nobody has any insight into their database, but it has a lot of reputation at stake. So you just trust it to perform all the updates correctly, pretty much. And on the other extreme, you have something like Bitcoin and Ethereum, where they say, oh, we throttle the network really hard to sort of keep this verification cost, this cost for people to actually do the accounting themselves, to walk through every step that was done and say, oh, I can verify without making any trust assumptions that all of this computation was done correctly, right? And in the middle between these two extremes, the centralized exchange and the completely decentralized blockchain, you have a pretty wide trade-off space, right? And that's where you find BSC, that's where you find Avalanche and Solana at some points across these spectrums, right? But sort of what I'm wondering is, are these other chains really going to, develop in any other way? Than Ethereum and Bitcoin. So their databases are also.
Yeah. I guess my answer would be they already have, and they will continue because they are attracting all the new users. I think this is just the reality of the space, right? And I think, when I told you that half of MetaMask users are BSC users and it kind of shocked you, it's because a lot of Ether OGs and Bitcoin OGs, they don't use other chains because they don't need the money, right? Like you don't need to make $1,000. You don't need to make $10,000, right? You're too wealthy to care. But that says more about you than it says about other people, right? So it's kind of my point, which is that I find that a lot of Ether OGs, they're in the mindset now where they're like, I'm already rich, and you have to understand why what I've done is so good, and also why what I'm preserving is so valuable. And valuable as it may, you have given very few outlets for new users to come and participate in what you've done. And so, that's the reality of the space. And having Matic is not an answer, right? Because if you have Matic, then they say, what is the difference between Matic and any other L1, right? And then you open up that door, and
there is none. Yeah.
Of course there's none, right? So I think that's kind of the reality of the space, and I agree with you 100% on there is a decentralization trade-off between each of these. And I think what the novel sort of understanding that I have, or that I think the market has as well, is that where Ethereum is on the trade-off scale, it is optimized for a world that it's struggling to maintain its network effect for EVM itself, where EVM developers are immediately deploying to every chain, and then users are using where they find it most convenient. So I would say in April or March, I would have said that Ether itself will benefit a lot from this multi-EVM. I believe I said that in a thesis. And
you did.
I think in part Ether has, right? It has outperformed Bitcoin quite a bit since then, because Ether benefits from being able to be ported around on EVM just much easier, right? So you can bring your, you can bring your Ether across different bridges. You can use it as collateral here and there, and so it has definitely benefited from that. But it's also underperformed other layer ones massively, and the reason why I do say performance is important is because this is also the incentive for people to get involved, right? So, if you look at the DeFi projects on Ethereum, where they have pretty much only gone down in dollars even over the past year. I mean, if someone had told you at the time we did that podcast where we predicted DeFi coins would enter the top 20, that they would actually all be down in dollars, you would have said you're insane, right?
Yeah.
But it's happened,
I think they have performed not that bad since then. They are up in dollars definitely, but down in Ether big time.
Well, they're down in Ether big time, but I think a lot of them are actually down in dollars, if I remember correctly. And so that's something that I don't think people are. I mean, privately, I've spoken to a lot of people, and they say what those reasons are, but I think that publicly, it's something that is a bit taboo to talk about, right? Because you have to admit a lot of kind of things, and so I think, I mean, my diagnosis would be a few things, right? I think one is that the early Ether builders, they were very committed to Ethereum as a network, and so where the founder's dilemma kind of plays in is that if you already own a lot of Ether and then it's gone up 20x, you're already wealthy, right? So once you're already wealthy, your incentive to build also starts going down, right? Because what is the incentive to build at that point? And that we've seen a lot in the Ethereum DeFi space, I think. I think on the idea of going cross chain and acquiring users, I think that this is very much a knife fight, right? This is very much a fight to see which builders are the most aggressive at creating products for new users. And creating experiences for new users. And I find it interesting too that like when I speak to some of these Ethereums, some are very good at going cross chain and using them, but a lot of like others, their mentality is like I'm too rich to have to do that. I'm too wealthy, like I don't need to, right? So this is, I think, the big divide really in the space, which is that it's to the point where Ethereum can no longer claim to have all the innovations, right? Like now you actually see the opposite, where Synthetics is trying to copy what Luna's done with, ecosystem airdrops and multiple projects on it. And it's we're kind of seeing that reverse copying on a number of projects now as well. And so I think that there's an arrogance to the Ethereum community, similar as there was an arrogance to the Bitcoin community. And I actually think that you'll see this arrogance play out in almost every community, not in a fatalist way, but just as a product of founder's dilemma. Like if people already become billionaires, people already become worth a lot of money, their basic worldview becomes, how do I perpetuate this idea, as opposed to how do I compete in the open market? So I think that kind of reality is the main reason why I expect DeFi building and DeFi to do better on newer chains because the builders there are just hungrier, and they're also trying to create applications for 1 million users or 10 million users.
I feel like to some degree you're making the same mistake that you warned me against a couple of months ago when you said what the Bitcoin maximalists think and say actually doesn't matter at all for what makes Bitcoin like a good network and a good investment. And in this case, I think you're saying the same thing about the Ethereum maximalists.
I think it does. I think it does matter though. I think it does matter though in a few big ways, right? I think the main way that it matters is on the question of investment, right? So if you look at what kinds of things, what kinds of things have been hyped now in Ethereum and then done very poorly, we can make an entire list of this, right? We can talk about loot for one, but we can also talk about things like Wi-Fi, right? Or we can also talk about there's a whole many of these things. And I think actually, if you look at what a lot of these have in common, it's just this idea that you have to do it on Ethereum, or otherwise you don't do it at all. And so, like loot, for instance, when they launched like the M loot, whatever, like 2 accounts took all the loot. Basically, they took all the rare stuff, so it was just dead on arrival, right? And you've seen a whole host of these things too. Like we backed an NFT project called Monaco, and the founder of that is like a big Ethereum believer or whatever. And he's just like, how, like, so we did a full gas subsidy for everybody who minted, which cost us, a few hundred ETH or whatever. And then later we're just like, how do we even do this? So we're gonna end up launching the token on BSC and AVAX. But it's just something where like really people have been like contorting their bodies to be able to deploy things, and for guys like Andre, he was like, okay, I'm just gonna do this on Phantom, right? And then for the Aave guys, they're like, I'm just gonna build on Avalanche, right? And so we've already seen that diaspora now, because I think the whole social pressure against going to other chains has really died down now in a big way, in part because Ethereum has sort of lost the plot in that kind of sense, right? And so I think that in that framework, what I would say is like, culture does matter, because it's the question of what is each smart contract community offering to new users, to new developers, and what is it, what kinds of things are actually possible, basically, for them to do. And so I think that Starkware is another interesting example where as Darknet gets bigger, the question is like, does it owe rent to Ethereum? Does it owe these kinds of things to other chains? Of course it doesn't, right? And of course that they will also follow a path to make technology that is useful for people. But basically, I guess my broader point is that this idea of like the rent being paid to the holder of the coin, of the oldest smart contract coin, this is very much now in the culture of Ethereum, in part because of the ideas of EIP 1159, which is that rightly it starts to claim it starts to claim this idea that the holders of ETH benefit from the activity on ETH, and this idea has now been copied on other chains. But I think where Ethereum has made the mistake, or where Ethereum has a challenge, is that it's done so, but it's lost the user network effect without having enough good scaling, right? So the beginning of this year, when I was speaking to a lot of Ethereum people, they told me optimistic rollups going to be huge. It's going to be a one and done, and it's going to win the market. And what I've seen now, and at the time we talked about like what about the fact that it takes 7 or 8 days to bridge down, and they said stuff like, well, of course there will be market makers, and market makers will provide the two-way. Well, just the other day we were asked for a quote. The guy wanted to bring 3K ETH down from Arbitrum to mainnet, and I have no other side for that. Right? Because what are the odds that I find someone who wants to go the other way for the size? I mean, you see what I'm saying, right? It's just like there's kind of there's very much a gap between the ambitions of an Ethereum and the kind of stated goals of an Ethereum, and then the reality of the execution. But I think where the coin has done well relative to Bitcoin is that Bitcoin has also not done much as well, right? And the market all said, well, at least Ether is better than Bitcoin in that sense. And that's why I think zooming out, I actually find it really dangerous. Sort of a lot of the talks about like Ether flipping Bitcoin, or sort of Ether is better store value than Bitcoin, because actually it kind of misses the point. Both coins are down since May, and other coins are up way more, and other coins are also growing way faster. So I think that kind of would almost be like the Max Payne scenario for the crypto markets, where if Bitcoin and Ether were both seen as sort of older tech, or like older projects where you can't really get rich anymore, and it's just old people hold these coins, and then here are the new coins where you can actually participate. Well, that gets you into a multi-coin world, right? And that gets you into something that the OGs will find dystopian, but they would have trouble convincing others that it's dystopian. You see what I'm saying, right?
Well, I see why about this sort of that this is a cultural argument.
Yes,
and
very much
I see
so.
why
Very much
it
so.
it can be very effective. I would say, like, we don't get around the point that as a fundamental argument, as a tech argument, it has no validity, because what all the other blockchains are doing, in the worst case, they are only trading sort of computational integrity, or sort of the accountability of the blockchain for more throughput. And this only scales to, this is not real scalability, and it only sort of gets them so far. And then after a while, they just run into the exact same problem. Their blockchain is also full. And then are we saying sort of Avalanche has abandoned their users, or Solana has abandoned their users? At some point they can become just a centralized database, but then you can just do that from the start as well. So it's not really, this approach in the worst case gets you nothing. And in the best case, they actually have very similar roadmaps to Ethereum, where they say, oh, we're going to have a sharded database, basically, where you only have to, where only sort of the proof that a lot of computation happens off chain, and you only prove to the main chain that the computation was done correctly. This is
exactly
sort of a form of sharding.
This is kind of where we agree, right?
Yeah.
What I'm saying is basically that the roadmaps in the end game may all look very similar, and then it's a question of which team will actually execute that vision. And I'm saying that Ethereum, if it is solely trying to outperform Bitcoin, it will actually lose in the execution of that roadmap versus other L1s whose goal is more, in part because they start from nothing, but also because their only way to grow is to get more users. They will actually lose in that. And so we've seen that, right? With the Avalanche gas has gone down again a huge amount after the recent upgrade, the Apricot 5 upgrade. And, this is something that I only expect to continue to happen, because even if we accept, let's say Ethereum and Avalanche must follow the same roadmap, then it's a question of who will execute that roadmap better, who will execute it faster, who will be more likely to serve users over holders. This is something that I think is the point, right? It's not about if two have the same roadmap, then automatically the older one wins. This is kind of my point, which is that if two have a similar roadmap, actually the newer one is more likely to win, because that's also what we've seen in tech, right? And Samani, he makes the analogy of iOS, or he makes an analogy of mobile operating systems in 2009, where at that time there were a whole host of operating systems, and people just said, BlackBerry just has to win this. They have the network effect, and this has to win that, and this has to win this. And then if you look at what actually happened, the newer ones just, because they don't have technical debt, and because they have a different mentality, which is not serving their existing users, but trying to get new ones. That dynamic is actually, I do see that playing out in a big way, and it's something that I think in part what we're seeing now is crypto trying to digest this, and I think that look, I personally believe in the store value case of crypto, and so I think Bitcoin and Ether share that, and they will go up a lot in dollars, and we'll all continue to be rich, right? But when it comes to executing roadmaps for onboarding users into crypto networks, I don't see Bitcoin or Ether really being able to do this. And I personally am in the school of thought that Bitcoin and Ether will go up anyways because the store value case is viable enough. But I do also increasingly see someone like Samani's point, which is that, you know, if at some point BNB has 1 billion users, even if it's a database, are you going to convince people that they need to buy Bitcoin as a store of value or Ether as a store of value? You might not be able to, right?
Yeah.
Because that narrative will not be very interesting. They will be like a cult. It will be perceived as a cult. And so that, I think, is something that we do need to keep in the back of our minds when we think about how does the new user come to crypto and how do they see the space and how do they interact with it, and not to see it as dystopian, but to see it as a competition of free monies and a competition of free networks, right? And so these are some of the biggest questions in crypto value accrual, of course.
Yeah, I mean, for any new user, I would always recommend, if you have $10,000, you just don't belong on Ethereum. Like, you should use BSC, you should use Polygon, you should use Arbitrum, you should use Solana, you should use Avalanche. And that's always sort of what I recommend, because there's just no point. Ethereum layer 1 is not going to scale for regular users. It doesn't have to. That's not the point. So if you just like zoom out 2 years, then or maybe let's say 5 years, there's not going to be any regular users. You will have some whale users on Ethereum layer 1, but otherwise it's just basically proofs of off-chain computation. Like the entire chain is just going to be full of sort of this kind of settlement transactions where rollups send their proofs to the layer 1 and they sort of update the balance of some application, like DYDX does today, for example. And that's what makes these applications non-custodial and trustless. And I think this is the roadmap for all layer 1 chains. I think you can say, oh, but we can have like a more scalable, like a chain that has more throughput, so we can attract more users today. But I think you yourself made the point why this kind of network effect is not something that buys you anything in the long term, because there can always be a new chain, and this new chain doesn't have to even to do anything different in terms of tech. It can just say, we're new, and when you come to us, then you can be early again. And we just pay a lot of incentives, and the same game starts over again. So that's why, personally, I'm not really interested in participating in these things, because I don't see them as credible attempts to, actually scale a blockchain. And sort of, when we said blockchains are only about sort of having a database with computational integrity, the Ethereum roadmap, and it's not only Ethereum executing this roadmap, but the Ethereum roadmap, the one of having a sharded database and a layer 1 that has only proofs, I think that's the only credible attempt at actually scaling this property. And so I'm interested in sort of all blockchains that take this approach, but for the others, I think it's just short-sighted.
But I think what you're missing is that you're taking kind of an objectivist approach, right? You're kind of saying this must be the solution that is the most technologically valid, and hence you're only interested in that. Well, be that as it may, these were the kind of criticisms put on Solana in the early days, and what we've seen is that Solana has actually attracted a whole huge amount of grassroots developers and huge amounts of application interest. Right, I would say the last 20 of our application bets, 15 plus of them are non-Ethereum, mainly because we prefer to do bets where we can see it get to 1 million users. And I think for a lot of the other funds, even the funds that were quite against Solana, I see them now trying to get into these rounds too. And so it's just something that, while I hear you on your vision of where the technology should be and how it looks, I do also see that the way that the industry is going is much more pragmatic, which is to say, I want to onboard the users now, and that's the goal, right? And so I just think that there needs to be a broad. Okay, put it this way: I think there needs to be a broad respect from the Ethereum community for users. I don't think there's quite that respect for users, and you can argue that there doesn't need to be, because Ethereum is on this mission to scale in this robust way. But we're getting into Bitcoin Lightning Network type of logic now too, right? Where, be that as it may, you're free to do what you wish, but you do run some risks of losing network effects. And so I think that's kind of what I would say about this. I mean, I think fundamentally it's talking on two different planes, right? Or it's talking past each other, where the set of priors are just different. So my set of priors is to say, okay, we can invest in Bitcoin and Ether as stores of value. That's fine. And we speculate on when we buy them and when we sell them, and the global demand for user and the global demand for crypto monies, right? But at the same time, we also feel that applications on Ethereum have really suffered from optimistic rollup not being competitive, and then later on, newer scaling not coming out. And the world we live in today is very different from the world we imagined when Ethereum DeFi was sort of at their highs. And so seeing that world, I'm an introspective person, so I look at that and I ask myself, why did it fail? Right? What happened? And the reasons that I'm seeing, or the kind of the realities that I believe I am perceiving, are that, well, first of all, the builders are actually better on these other chains because they have chosen those other chains because they want to reach users. So I see that with Do Kwon and Luna. I see this with a few other projects. And this, I think, is actually the anti-culture case for Ethereum, which is that it actually is unable to provide a space for these type of builders. I remember during a Clubhouse where Andre Cronje, he said, I think this was in like March, I can't remember exactly when, but he said, like, if you're an EVM builder today, you need to go to BSC immediately, right? And then, at that time, like then a whole host of people went to BSC. But I think that this is the future of smart contracts, application space, and users. And so from my point of view, I do have a bit of regret and nostalgia for the ETH DeFi at times, and I wish that it would have gone better. But I think that the reason why I was so triggered by Kane is because he kind of is kind of the ultimate example of sort of an ETH OG who did very well holding ETH basically, and then the project itself has kind of not been as and it's not something where I'm like shaming builders or this or that, but he's the one who says, anyone who's not building on Ethereum layer 2 is like, we're going to keep a track of all your names, and then, I'm not going to welcome you back to the community. I mean, this is dangerous stuff, I think. And this is stuff where I don't believe in it. So I think that at the end of the day, the same problems that happen to Bitcoin maximalists are happening to Ethereum maximalists. And the problem for Ethereum is that while it matters less for Bitcoin because you don't have to do anything with Bitcoin, it matters more for Ethereum because you actually have to do things on Ethereum. And so if builders are starting to go to other chains, which I see them doing, this is a matter of debate that I have with some other funds, but I do see builders going to other chains, especially Solana, especially Avalanche, then the floodgates are very open on that, and we won't be able to claim in 2 years that all the innovation is on Ethereum, right? And once you lose that, then really what you have left is you can say that the EVM enshrines ETH as the holy asset, which I think it is happening, and that it shares a store of value case with Bitcoin, and that can be fine as it is, right? That really can be the end game of ETH, and it can do well. But I don't think that this is something where that alternate layer ones are sort of discredited for their approach, because it's kind of fascinating, almost like as a fractal, but I kind of see like ETH as being what original Bitcoin wanted to be in some ways, right? Which is sort of having NFTs and having DeFi and these kind of things. And then I see like alt layer ones trying to be what Ethereum was trying to be, which is like, reaching a billion.
The thing
users
where Vitalik said
like
that if there's like, what did he say? If there's like
5-cent
Yeah,
fees. He said if Bitcoin has 5-cent fees,
that's not
way
the
too
internet
high.
of money. Then internet of money has failed.
That's
Yeah, I mean, stuff like that, of course,
Yeah.
makes you look
So-
very bad in the future. That's a given.
Yeah. So I mean, and I think it's I
Yeah.
still own more ETH than pretty much. I still own more Ether than pretty much anybody I know. So it's not something where.
But I think this is. I mean, this is also to me. This is also like a warning sign.
But
I mean, Vitalik is a very smart guy, and he already.
Yeah.
First, like the Bitcoin Cash people fell on their face, making the claim that you can guarantee some kind of low cost environment without sacrificing all decentralization. Then Vitalik made the same statement. He fell on his face. And now I see, for me, it's just Groundhog Day. I see the same. I see a new class of people repeat the same things that already the Bitcoin Cash people have failed at. Vitalik has failed at. They are not going to succeed, in my opinion. I think they are going to fail for the same reasons. And that's sort of what makes me a bit frustrated about seeing these arguments, because it's not, yes, I'm taking like a technologist stance on this, where I say, yeah, I'm better at evaluating this than the market. I can say this is going to fail for, technological reasons. This is going to run into its scaling limits. And at some point, also the narratives around it are going to collapse when the fees go up, and they have no credible scaling roadmap. So, but to me, this just feels like I've seen the story like play out more than once in the past.
I think the sort of shortest rebuttal I would give to that is to say, just look at the network growth rates on the other networks, and then say, let's assume that they run into scaling problems, and let's assume that they solve them in the way that would be maybe not acceptable to Ethereum people, and certainly not acceptable to Bitcoin people. I mean, keep in mind too, a lot of Ethereum's decentralization trade-offs are completely unacceptable to Bitcoin people, right? And so I think that then you're very much back in the fractal that I'm talking about, which is that Ethereum people making the same arguments against other chains that Bitcoin people make against Ethereum, right? And I guess what I would say is that I do see these finding product market fit, and I do see these teams being at least more motivated to onboard users. And so I guess what I'm warning, or not warning, but what I'm kind of predicting is that that alt layer ones will continue to do very, very well. And I also see this in the Web2 investors that I speak with, right? Because when the Web2 investors come to crypto, I think some of them, they gravitate toward the Ethereum vision. But then as they do, they start to see like, okay, well, how fast is this network growing? Because I'm investing in network effects, right? How fast is the network growing? And then they see that all the other chains are having way faster network effects. And then they're saying, okay, well, what is the reason for this? And so if the reason is that Ethereum is waiting for its own scaling, then it starts to sound like Bitcoin, right? It starts to sound a lot like Bitcoin. So then they're like, okay, well, I clearly need a hedge because these are already outperforming Ether by a lot. And on top of that, there's very credible activity happening. I understand that Ether people say it's not decentralized, but I also understand that Bitcoin people say Ether is not decentralized. You see what I'm saying there, right? So that's kind of what I'm predicting, basically. And I think that for me, like I kind of had the thesis, fortunately, relatively early during the bear market, that I think all alt layer ones are deeply undervalued because these are real teams building stuff. And I was fortunate enough to, so like Polkadot, Kusama, Avalanche, Near. We pretty much said at that time, pretty much any alt layer one that is doing that is shipping code is incredibly undervalued by the market. I think Richard, who we had on our podcast at DACM, he had basically that thesis, and he helped us kind of see it, which is that for the same reasons that Ethereum grew very quickly, these chains also will grow very quickly because the penetration of smart contract users and just applications is zero of the main population. So it's a world where we live in where just to give an example, right? Like Tezos just did a great deal with Ubisoft where they're going to give something like 10 million wallets to Ubisoft users and then hold NFTs in them. So, I can see a world where chains can do well just being used in one country, right? And then going from there. And so, I guess what I'm saying is like the world is a very, very big place. And I see layer ones doing very different approaches to biz dev, very different approaches to users. And I think that this is healthy actually for broader crypto. It does hurt a bit of Ethereum dominance. Like I think Ethereum would be much closer to flipping Bitcoin today if Ethereum had managed to find, if it basically what we think of as the scaling roadmap in 2025, if it had been achieved by today, right? But be that, being that we're in the world we are in today, I see sort of more of a hybrid Bitcoin and Ether will share store value case, and then I see a multitude of alt layer ones, and I think that, not to say that this is good or bad, but just to say this is, I think, just the reality.
Why do you? So Ethereum has also, of course, gone through periods of extreme growth. And back in the day, we used to use this as an investment case for Ethereum over Bitcoin, right? We saw that, Bitcoin was valued much higher, but Ethereum growth in any relevant metric was just leaving Bitcoin completely in the dust. There were more.
I think what I realized looking back is that we were asking the wrong question. We were asking the wrong question, which is the OG question, which is, should I own more Ether or Bitcoin? But that's actually the wrong question.
Well, my question to you would have been, why do you think that the growth that these newer chains are seeing is going to be more sticky than the growth that Ethereum has seen?
What I would say is that their growth has already been much faster than Bitcoin and Ethereum, and their growth can continue to be much faster because, one, they don't have technical debt. Bitcoin has technical debt, right? Ethereum has huge technical debt. These new ones, they don't have technical debt, in part because they're more centralized, but also in part because they're newer, right? So, they're already proof of stake. Well, for Ether, it will be very hard to go proof of stake. It will take months and months, right? And there will be a lot of questions as we go into it. And so technical debt is one reason. Also, I think the spirit of community is another, right? Where the concept of getting in on the ground floor is very attractive to people. And, if you look at Ether today, like, it doesn't offer the opportunities, I think, that it did when people were around in 2019. So even if you look at, like, we're talking about airdrops, right? Like, all this stuff is for if you were a user in 2019, as far as I'm concerned. Like ENS, you registered it in 2019. Using some of these products, okay, like some of them late 2020, but they're all kind of like, I would posit that it's all the same 2,000 users, 2,000 to 5,000. That are basically benefiting from this, and so that's kind of the big challenge, I think, which is Ethereum's growth of users on L1 has basically gone to zero, right? Because of the fees, and I can accept the argument that that's fine because we'll do rollups, but I would then also argue that if you assume that's true, then the growth rates on alt layer ones will be very fast because there is a demand for people to get involved in crypto, and this is where they will go. And so for me, it's trivial that the growth rate of user counts and activity on other chains will be faster than on Ethereum. It's a broader question, what will outpace the other in dollars today from where we are here? Because obviously we are already up 1,000x on Solana. We're already up hundreds of X's on these other coins, and these are all kinds of we're trying to get to questions of like, what is a fair percentage of Ethereum market cap these things should be. But I think when it comes to user counts, when it comes to activity levels, when it comes to new builders, new passionate builders who want to build billion-dollar applications, I very much see these going to Solana, Starkware, Avalanche, and a few others. And I think that that's just natural. So I do think that when there's more opportunities to deploy on L2, I think they'll also do so. But I think that Ethereum has lost that network effect of being able to say, all innovators come to my chain and join my community. I didn't realize it quite early enough. I think if I had, I would have just sold all my Ether for Solana and Avalanche. But be that as it may, I was comparing Ether too much to Bitcoin, and so I suffered that fate along with you, basically. As part of the sort of the OG crowd now that debates Bitcoin versus Ether all day, right? And I've met young guys, like retail guys, like they're like 50% SOL, 50% AVAX from $1. And these guys are just like, why do you even talk about Bitcoin and Ether? Like, what is the point? And so like there is that perspective that I have to remind myself of each time, because each generation, each crypto wave has brought in new people, right? And their perspective is very different from yours and mine. And speaking to these kind of guys, I am sometimes struck by like, are we the boomers?
Yes. I think I would be. I mean, I would agree that somebody who comes in today won't use Bitcoin and Ethereum, and they shouldn't, because for the reasons that we talked about. But that doesn't mean that they are any more right in the long term. I think if you've only been here for half a cycle, then I think there's definitely the risk of sort of overvaluing what is new and what you know over what is long-term viable. I would say that at the end of the day, I'm a pragmatist. I have no ideological reason to support Ethereum. I would say I'm pretty far from being like an ideologue. I think that in terms of its roadmap, it's going to be cheaper and better for a user and an application builder to use a rollup that posts proofs to Ethereum than these alternate layer ones, if they are just a layer one. So they can have the same sharding roadmap, and then I think it's sort of a fair game. But I think that this approach is probably going to win out over the monolithic layer one approach. And I say that because I believe in it for that it's like pragmatically the best approach, and not because I think it's somehow more, I don't know, that it's like for moral reasons or whatever.
Right. I mean, I get what you're saying, but I guess my point is that for me, as someone who invests prolifically in applications, I see the strongest applications being built on non-Ethereum these days. And that's something that I would have been absolutely, if you had told me this a year ago, I would have said absolutely no way, zero chance. All the innovation I see is on Ethereum. And now all the application innovation I see is not on Ethereum. And so this is just, for me, that's my perspective on it. And that makes me sad in a way, because it's different from what I thought it would be. And it's different from what I hoped it would be. And so I think that that's kind of where the biggest fear for me in crypto is that if we get to a world where the end game is then you don't need to have any like you get to the most centralized chain, and then that is the thing that I mean, I'm kind of seeing this, like, and it scares me with some of these Web 2 guys, and they're saying like, well, you know what? You don't even need crypto. You just have tokens. The whole point is tokens. Once you have tokens, you can incentivize everybody. You incentivize your users. You can get rid of the fucking blockchain, right? Just give tokens. And this is I mean, Kobe was tweeting about this a bit as well. And this is what really scares me, because if we don't make reasonably credible applications that scale to users, you do run some risk that like we're just talking about tokens in 5 years that run in actual databases. So I come from that perspective, but I mean I think at the end of the day, like it's the points on both sides are really well understood now. I think the market will decide, the new users will decide, the new builders will decide, and I think it's not even worth debating, honestly, because I think it's more about prognostication, right? So people will set their chips the way they want to set them, and then that's it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm a pretty strong believer in the thesis that fast forward 5 years and people will be using applications. They will not be using blockchains. Yes. They will be going directly to applications, like they go to their bank, their broker, whatever, their super app, and they will be using these applications, and they will know that it's non-custodial. But they won't know on what chain it runs. And they won't have to. They don't have to care. And then it's purely a matter of what chain can get the best properties to builders and to users. And there won't be any sort of any reason to favor one over the other for any other reason. And that's definitely also the approach that I'm taking. And if it's true that other chains can capture better builders and can retain them in the long term, then I definitely think that these chains are in a good position. Personally, I don't see that right now. I think definitely it's very attractive for a new builder to build on new chains, but it's also because these chains tend to be emptier, and this is not going to sustain. So there's some amount of short-termism, and there tend to be big incentives, right? So between building on Ethereum and building on Avalanche, where I know that Ava Labs is paying out huge, they are dumping like AVAX incentives on any application that builds there. Of course, that's a huge bribe for me as an application builder to favor their chain. But I also know that this is not long-term sustainable, right? So at some point, this sort of incentivized growth will taper off, and then what matters is the actual technical trade-offs.
Well, I think the biggest counter argument to what you said is that it's already been wrong for many months now, right? Where, from the vision that we would have seen a year ago to now, it's already been wrong. And then, so I think the question is then, at what point will that vision be correct? And I think the answer that most Ethereum people give is that it will be correct when we finally have an L2 scaling that is competitive with the user experience on layer ones. That is what they say. But what they're underestimating is that the new users don't have an allegiance to ETH the way that you do, right? So even when that is out, there is no guarantee that the new user will then say, I value the technical trade-off of Ethereum, I'm going to go there. That, I think, is the biggest point. And I would also make the point that Starkware does not belong to Ethereum, right? Starkware belongs to itself. And they very much do not plan to pay rent to Ethereum. So this is something, too, where I would say, arguably all L2s will not want to pay rent to Ethereum, in my opinion. They will also end up becoming like L1s. So that kind of is my biggest counterpoint, which is that the execution layer, the execution environment that provides the best experience for applications, whether incentivized or not, once it has those and once it has a flywheel of users coming in, that's incredibly powerful. And I've seen that with BSC and Binance, where even with a weaker technical roadmap, they've been able to capture half of all. I mean, they just have by far the most users of any chain. It's not even close, right? And that's why all the new GameFi companies are launching their games on BSC, because that's just where the users are. So I think that it's just something where I find the Ethereum rhetoric to be more out of touch with where I see applications and users going than ever before. And this is something that I think is honestly irrelevant to the average ETH holder, because like I said, I think ETH's value accrual now is not coming from that stuff. It's coming from people buying Bitcoin and Ether together as part of a monetary basket. And so I get why they're also out of touch with it, because their goals are different and their kind of ideas are different. But if we're talking about where users are and where they're going, where builders are going, I do find it very facile to say, well, as soon as we get our layer 2s up, then they're all going to come back. I personally not a believer in that, because I don't think that's just not how I've seen the world play out.
If we say the builders just build on what's cheapest and gives them the best guarantees to them and their users, then I think that there's a good chance that many applications will favor building on a rollup that settles to Ethereum, like we see with DYDX, right? DYDX, you couldn't build it on a layer 1 blockchain, not really. You can only build it in an environment where computation is really cheap, even cheaper than it is on Solana. And I think that we're probably going to see more of that in the future.
I mean, DYDX is a great example too, right? Because if you look at what Antonio said, he said that we built this on Starkware, and Starkware finalized it to Ethereum. If they have our opportunity to finalize other chains, they will definitely do so. And the Starkware guys have said from the beginning, like, we will offer this to all chains, right? So Ethereum does not. I guess my point is Ethereum does not own the idea of a rollup. They do not own the idea of a ZK rollup.
That's
They
true.
did fund it in the beginning, the Ethereum Foundation, but they absolutely do not own the idea of it. So if this is such a good idea, this is not an Ethereum idea. This is a point that Kyle Samani made in a thread a while ago, which is that Ethereum people's main rebuttal to why they don't have the user network effect now is that they say, well, wait for ZK rollups to get huge, and then I'm going to have it. But ZK rollups are going to be everywhere. So this is not unique to Ethereum.
Exactly. I think, but that's it's interesting how we both see sort of the same argument as
You see what I'm saying,
being
right?
in favor of our point.
Yeah, you see what I'm saying? Because your point assumes a point of reference, right? You have a very objectivist way of viewing the world, and you have this point of reference, which is that it started with ETH and it comes back to ETH. So the activity all comes back in the end because we all recognize this. Similar to when you're very bullish Bitcoin, right? Like the monetary maximalism, like it all comes back, and we're all competing as monies, but then it all comes back to the thing itself. And kind of what I see is that this may or may not happen, but I don't have the certainty that you do that it will come back to Ethereum, because I do see the users, I do see the applications like very much building elsewhere. So for me, it's far more dangerous to have certainty than to have like uncertainty in this kind of a situation where I see like 9 out of 10 projects building on Ethereum today.
Okay, so I should also clarify. I definitely agree with you. I don't think everything's going to come back to Ethereum. I'm a very strong believer in the multi-chain world. A lot of chains that are going to be connected via light client proofs or some other, like we going to have a very diverse set of bridges that connect blockchains using different trust assumptions. That's one thing that I strongly believe. B, one thing that we already discussed, I think people are not going to interact with blockchains in the future. It is applications that are going to interact with blockchains, and people are going to interact with the applications and the wallets, and that is their only interface to the world of blockchain. And eventually users will not decide to use chain A, chain B, chain C, but it will be the application developers who decide what chain gives them the best assurances and the cheapest cost. And C, I believe in the unbundling of the blockchain. So right now, Ethereum and other chains, they are sort of many things at once. They are consensus, they are data storage, and they are computational. It's all happening within the same layer. And increasingly, I think people see that it actually makes more sense to unbundle these different steps, because then you can build layers that are strongly optimized to do one or the other. And I think I only believe I'm cautiously optimistic that Ethereum is understanding that and sort of getting in position to dominate in this world where the different layers of the blockchain are unbundled, right? So they say, yeah, there's no place for computation on Ethereum. This is just a place where people, post proofs of data and then settle between different applications and so on. And partially, they also say this is a place where you can store data if you need the highest assurances. But I don't even think Ethereum is really going to compete as a data availability layer. So I completely agree that Ethereum is sort of going to lose. It's not even going to gain. It's going to lose a lot of its current activity. And this is going to happen on more optimized blockchains like rollups, like Starkware, and so on. But nonetheless, I think that other blockchains are in an even worse position for how this future is going to develop. And that makes me sort of cautiously optimistic on Ethereum.
I think the whole premise or the whole worldview is just different from the way I view it. I think like to caricature a sort of an Ethereum person who I'm most derisive about, it would be someone who's like mainly like half their tweets per day are about how other Alt L1s are not decentralized and how they're going to fail. And I think that be that as it may, like you just have to find something better to do with your time, right? Like it's the same as the Bitcoin maximalists who like literally half their tweets are about why Ethereum is too centralized. is the same. It reminds me of the same thing. It comes from the same part of the brain too, actually, and I think it's actually the same type of mentality because during the bear market, Ethereum almost died, right? Like it was almost to the point where people thought it would be chain death, and so that did create like this culture of saying, okay, well, we are going to defend ETH, the asset, and ETH the value, and that's actually one of the reasons why I got more interested in investing in ETH as an asset at that time, like $100, because I just thought, this is actually undervalued as a tribe, as a network. And so
these people went through so much, they are never going to
went through so much, and they're still building on it anyway. They lost all their money. They got liquidated on their maker CDPs. They're still building on it. I went to all the Ethereum meetups that I could in Southeast Asia, and so I really sense that, and I think now we're at the flip point of that, kind of where it's I feel like that same energy I see everywhere else except on where I think it needs to be on Ethereum, and so that kind of scares me, because then if I like zoom out a bit more, then I recognize like just as I was early to ETH at that time, other people have been early to Solana or to Avalanche or to other chains, and also seen that, and so then I kind of just, I'm always very skeptical, or I'm very, very, very cautious, because I know this is an effect in crypto, and it's a wealth endowment effect where like a tribe becomes wealthy and then poo-poos everybody else, right? So Bitcoiners became wealthy and then spend their whole life poo-pooing everybody else. And I'm arguing partially that like Ethereum people become wealthy and then start poo-pooing everybody else. And it's not all Ethereum people, right? It's not all, but I do think that that's not healthy. And I do think that if they take that too far and they ingrain that in the culture, then it will end up very much like a Bitcoin roadmap, which is not great, right, in terms of technology. And so I think that's kind of my perspective. I mean, it's not a question of optimistic or not optimistic. It's just the reality that I perceive, kind of thing. I don't make predictions based on like how I feel it will happen. I make predictions just purely based on the idea that things that are happening like this, if they continue, then what will that mean? And I think that the legitimacy of Alt Layer 1 is incredible now versus during the bear market. During the bear market, when I bought Solana SAFs, I was so embarrassed about it. I couldn't even tell anybody about it, because Solana was a dirty word. I don't know if you remember, but Solana was a dirty word back then. If you were talking about Alt Layer 1s back then, it was a dirty word in the Ethereum community. And so, fast forward to now, where I see the legitimacy of it from tier one investors, from traditional finance investors, and that's something that I think is striking, right? And it is different. And so I then ask myself the question: how will this continue? How will this continue to evolve? If this is the analogy of like operating systems, then the technical debt one struggles against the new ones, right? The ones with existing users struggle against the ones that have growing new users. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think that like everyone should just keep open mind, and I think that there is a strain of Ethereum maximalism that is getting pretty active, and I think that it is the same type of part of the brain as Bitcoin maximalism, and I think that it's very, very dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I also see these trends. It's not something that I participate in. When I see it, honestly, I just mute them, to be honest, same as I do with the Bitcoin maximalists. I think, fortunately, the culture in Ethereum is not so much in favor.
It's still better than Bitcoin in the sense that they at least are open-minded. I think interestingly, Bitcoin culture, I think, is getting better now. I think it kind of hit a low maybe a few months ago, and then now they're kind of like I was just speaking to our mutual friend Leo, who recently moved to Singapore, and he was saying how like in the Bitcoin community now there's like this really big push to like add scripting and to like make DeFi possible and these kind of things, right? Because they're just and I saw a great thread just the other day by Vake, who was saying how like these NFTs, why are we not doing NFTs now on Counterparty, right? Why do we not use NFTs to fund Bitcoin core developers? And it's actually a really interesting thing with the Free Ross NFT where I think one of the bidders who ended up losing, but he was like this anonymous Bitcoin billionaire whose plan was to burn the NFT. Like if he had won, his plan was to burn the NFT on Ethereum and reissue it on Counterparty. And so you're kind of seeing this renaissance possibly on Bitcoin where they just say, you know what, we're not going to actually call NFT scams. We're not going to actually call token scams or DeFi scams. We're just gonna like try stuff again, right? And try to make it. Yeah. So I mean, it's definitely bottomed in terms of that kind of stuff. Whether it's enough is a different question, but it's definitely bottomed. I mean, I see Ethereum maximalism still on the way up in general, and I think it's only made worse by the fact that new users are going into new chains, right? So at some point, I think it'll stop, but I do think that it's maybe just the structure of human civilization, actually, if you think about it, right? Because it's like, you kind of have, you kind of get to a point where you become the dominant in this sphere, and then you want everyone to recognize this, and then it becomes very tough to compete with newcomers too, because they take cheap shots, or they take shortcuts that you can't take, or they take things, and then so the reaction is to kind of insulate from that, right? And the reaction is to kind of justify the existing decisions and these kinds of things, and but soon it gets to a point where if it's taken too far, it runs the real risk of just being out of touch with what the market wants. And if it gets to that point, so an example of out of touch, in my opinion, would be optimistic rollup, where they actually thought there would be market makers to bridge on and off sizes. I think that the danger is to become out of touch, right? And I think that Ethereum has a better chance of not being out of touch because fundamentally, I think it's a very eclectic group of people, and there are different people working on different solutions. But I just don't think it's something that people should argue about like all the time. I think just the desire to have arguments about it shows the weakness already, in my opinion, because they could just be building instead, or they could just be acquiring users instead. So it's that's just the way I perceive. That's just the way I perceive what's happening.
I think you're not entirely guilt-free in starting this argument.
I think that I mean, for me, it's really an SNX thing too, because I mean, I've talked brightly about SNX for a long time, right? And kind of as the first DeFi project, and I've shilled SNX to people and said this is an incredible team, it's going to be this and be that, and it really has not. And then I've seen Luna do really well, and Luna is basically the same thing except just executed way better, right? And I thought a lot about like why did this happen? And at some point I owned a lot of Luna in the past too, and then I sold it for more ETH DeFi stuff, and now I've bought back a lot as well. But I just thought a lot about like what was my premise that back then, right? My premise then was like, well, you generally sell Alt L1s for more ETH, you generally sell other applications for more ETH DeFi, and then like that's the perspective that I'm coming from, right? It's coming primarily from one of saying, my thesis on this was very wrong, actually. And why was it so wrong? And, like in a way, like you and I, right? Like we misled people into the ETH DeFi vision of the world. I remember when we did that thing with Arthur and the, top DeFi projects, we talked about Luna and then we just poo-pooed it. We were like, like it's not on ETH, so we don't care, right? You remember that, right? And I think Luna market cap is like more than all the ETH stuff combined now. So it's just something where I think that it's a huge blind spot for us, and I am one who's like incredibly self-critical. So I just think, like, why do we have this blind spot? Like, what was the problem with this thesis? And I think I know the answer, which is that it just assumes a world where ETH is the only smart contract chain, and it also assumes a world where other people are just debating ETH versus Bitcoin all day, pretty much. So I think with that in mind, I think that SNX rubs me the wrong way because they, like optimistic rollup, like it basically I see it as like of all the projects that like should not be allowed to shame others for exploring scaling solutions, like Synthetics is like king among the ones that like don't have that right to shame anybody for it, right? So I think that this is just the reality, and I think too it's something where, I mean, the reason why I think it got so many likes and was just like so popular among basically everybody except for ETH maxis is that users don't like being talked down on by ETH maxis. They just don't like it. They actually don't like ETH maxis as people, and they also don't like Ethereum if it is the kind of chain that just says, okay, like, you should, you're using something centralized, right? Or you're doing something stupid, right? It's this paternalism that's very similar, by the way, to Bitcoin maximalist paternalism during the bear market, which is to say, oh, you own shit coins, oh, you own, this, there's all this stuff, shitcoin minimalism, all this kind of stuff. So I think that this is something that, as people think about harder, they will see the parallels, and I think they will see the danger. But with that said, I think that there's a big separation for me between whether ETH the asset will do well and Ethereum the network. I don't think the Ethereum. I'm less optimistic than you on Ethereum the network having any kind of dominance over smart contract execution space. So it's just a point of prediction, I guess, disagreement. I do see ETH the asset doing well in general. I'm not sure if it outperforms Bitcoin or not from here, but I think it will do well in general because it is a widely held asset that has a strong brand, and it also has great liquidity from AMM pools, from people putting their coins, in UniV3 pools, and so I think that it's not something where I'm telling people to like sell all their ether or like buy all the ether or anything like that. It's just I see a big gap between what Ether was supposed to be, what I thought Ethereum was supposed to be, and where it is today. I see that gap the biggest as sort of the most prolific investor in Ethereum DeFi and Ethereum NFTs for quite some time, and so this gap to me is just it's just saddening to see. So I come at it from that perspective. It's not the perspective of a multi-coin, which was just right from the beginning that Ethereum would not have this network effect as predicted. It's very much from one who believed in this and then now realizing that it's a much weaker network effect than postulated.
I love that about crypto, that even we who have been in crypto for so long and think about this all day can still have big disagreements about how we think the future is going to develop. And I think that makes it just the most intellectually the most interesting space in the world, and also the most interesting market. So I definitely appreciate the honest conversation that we had today.
It was fun.
Thanks, and take care.